Hey, John.
G'day,
Good morning.
Marina. What a drama this has been.
For folks listening, John just had to re-update his Zoom, but it seems like a day of updates because when I logged on this morning, my computer did the same. It took about 40 minutes to get through, and I was not sure whether that was going to have an impact or not. But thankfully, I had plenty of time. Day of updates.
Yeah, I mean, this is a byproduct of I haven't used this laptop for 2.5 months. I've just figured out. So
Where are you
it had
calling from, John?
six Zoom updates. I'm in Auckland today for the first time after lockdown, with a pretty full agenda. So yeah, it is quite surreal, really, after being used to traveling up here pretty much every week, to not be here for such a long period of time. It's pretty different.
Bit surreal, isn't it? Good to be back though.
I just see the lighting here is a bit of a challenge.
That's right. We can see your face pretty clearly, which is good. So a big welcome to everyone joining the webinar who's joined so far. I see people still coming through. Today's going to be a very important conversation and filled with a lot of value, as we always aim to do. But it's also going to be for many a challenging conversation in a good way of kind of provoking real talk and being able to go through the different modes of where people are at and help give guidance there. So I'm super excited for this conversation, John. So I guess kind of setting the tone just before we dive in on that, you've recently been putting out some different articles on LinkedIn, which a lot of people have been reading. Do you want to touch on a little bit about that? So in regards to, I guess, survival, sustain, and scale.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I'm not a LinkedIn author normally, but you know, what an amazing period of change we're going through. And so for me, and you know, I guess having the recognition around the landing pad, a lot of lockdown for me was having conversations with folks and being involved in companies of all different sizes, really. That actually just had one thing in common for once, which was fascinating, which was basically that the market, you know, rather than getting into the sort of specifics of the event in terms of COVID-19, I mean, the market had just shifted. The markets are always shifting, but this has just been such a rapid shift that it was leaving us, you know, from my board role on a state-owned enterprise in aviation through to you know, to a lot of the work I do with office hours and startups, and everybody was focused on the same issue for once in terms of a market change, and quite frankly, just, you know, grappling and to a large degree for a lot of companies still grappling with the impacts and the uncertainty. So I just, you know, to your question, started feeling like I was having the same sort of conversation to try and be useful and try and add a useful perspective to these people's thinking about how to respond to this. And it was starting to really show me two things. You know, one was that the whole mode of actually running your business as a founder or even an executive just needed to rapidly change. It needed to actually rapidly change to be really small steps. Not much was known beyond sort of a week in some industries or some companies, just in terms of where things were at. And the second piece was that I was kind of fascinated and frightened by a lot of the conversations I was having where, you know, this is a traumatic event, and I think a lot of people from a personal point of view were just challenged by how that was impacting. They were suddenly in their house, basically doing all their work as well as their family and their personal lives, and it impacts your thinking. I just don't think there's any other way of kind of addressing that. It really impacts your thinking. People get anxious. People get you know, really challenged around the normal mode they might have about making these decisions and thinking. And this is not just at the founder level; it's the advisors, it's the investors, and, you know, particularly in the startup mode. And so I was just having very consistent conversations with different types of companies, which all just sort of went back to this sort of, the first thing to have a good conversation about where you start to change and figure out the future is to make sure that everybody in the conversation starts from the right base and the same base of understanding. And I saw, you know, as we always see in our community, a lot of optimism, because as entrepreneurs, we're always, you know, glass half full. But in this case, it was actually challenging the reality of what they needed to do quickly. So The series is really about the question I asked people when I chatted to them, which was, can you just give me a quick sense of where your business is at today? And that's probably more from the point of view of the first couple of weeks of lockdown, in terms of what's actually happened, and what the basic metrics are. So that's where the sort of survival, sustain, scale picture comes. And obviously, the idea was that framework, which I've used in my head for many years, was to get people to a good starting point, all of them around the same page. Obviously, investors, advisors, they're not in the business every day, but now this whole situation, because there were big decisions to be made, required them to really get a quite a deep understanding of the business and the culture and where things are at, as well as all the financial metrics to kind of figure out what to do next.
Absolutely. And I guess a lot of these metrics may not have always been at the surface, whereas this has forced a lot of founders and people involved with startups to kind of really dig deep to try and make sense of this and to be in the best position with the uncertainty in front of them. I totally resonate with as founders listening right now and people involved with startups, optimism is it's a cornerstone in regards to being able to go out there and pursue bold dreams. And there's a lot of positive and important elements to that. But I guess there's also times where you have to balance that, right? And this is certainly one of those times where, yes, you've got to be able to have optimism and that kind of go-getter attitude, but you also have to peg it to reality, especially when you're in times where the market's shifted so much that if you don't, it could really put you out of business and be not good. So I guess there's a huge piece there around kind of the challenge of progressive versus being realistic, right?
Yeah, and I think this is not all bad. I mean, a number of organisations I'm involved with actually had a really positive impact on their business and demand for their services and products pretty early. And then there was also a realisation through the period that some of them also had even legacy technologies or legacy elements of the business that suddenly became very, very relevant and could engage their existing customer base in a really valuable way. So it was good for their bottom line, but it was also great to, I think the biggest piece missing for a lot of people around this, which increased the anxiety and the challenge making decisions, was just the feeling of helplessness. When you're asked basically to do nothing but stay in your house and kind of keep away from other people. Yeah. So even that's not a lot of us are used to working remotely and used to doing all this stuff, but when you've got that added sort of context of all the people around you, particularly those outside of work, it just changes the game certainly from a founder point of view. And we've always in Landing Pad had a consciousness, because we are a community of entrepreneurs, founded by entrepreneurs, is just that weight on the shoulders of the founder is always there around your obligations to kind of your team, to the teams, the families of the teams, and the best entrepreneurs are very conscious of that. And it's quite challenging to actually get objective about what you have to do, primarily for yourself as the founder and often the majority shareholder of the business, as well as have that sort of really good spirited obligation and consciousness of the other people involved in this venture that you've built. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. And just before we jump in and do that, John, just a reminder to everyone that's joining the call and joined the call to ask questions as we go through. So as you'll see, we've changed to Zoom opposed to Crowdcast. So the way to do that isn't too much different. There's a little Q&A box in the center of the screen. So if you click that, you'll be able to open it up and fire away your questions, and we'll answer it as we go, and some we might circle back to at the end as well. So survival, sustainable, scaling. I wonder if our approach to do this, John, is if maybe we systematically go through what each one is, some of the key observations that you're noticing there, what some of the key challenges are, and then we can kind of go through that way.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, starting with the one I think that's caused the most conversation, and it's probably a byproduct of where our community often are in terms of being an early stage business, is the survival mode. So I think the challenge there, and the way I define that and think about it, is that, you've got a pretty defined cash runway. So probably less than 12 months of available cash based on the expenses you have today. you haven't reached that stage in the business of figuring out how to generate that revenue in a repeatable and consistent way yet. So I guess that's in part a sort of what we call a product market fit issue. And when you really look at it hand on heart, there isn't in that sort of horizon of cash flow a way that you can see that levers that revenue over the cost, so that you've actually got a sort of a nil impact on your monthly burn. So survival mode to me is where it's like, okay, well, if that's where we're at, there's really only three ways that you can address that if you really take it up to the sort of 30,000 foot view. Obviously, there's a lot of detail and context in those, but thinking about it logically, you can either do best efforts and approach a strategy where you just drive to get that revenue, get your cost base really, really tight, take all the cost out of the business that you can without sort of effectively sort of freezing it in most cases, although some people have been able to sort of hibernate their business, and then drive to get out there and actually build that revenue line. So of course that really depends for a lot of ventures on how big the delta is between the burn. Is it like is your revenue at 75% of your costs, or is it at 10? And that's nothing but a sort of stage of where you're at in terms of building that business. So there's no judgment around that. So you can do that, or the second thing you can do is you can make your business more investable, or optimize your investability before you run out of cash. So that's a conversation I've been having with folks in a couple of frames, probably most consistently. One is going back to existing investors in the business and saying, obviously we're all very aware of what's happened. Yes, we have been one of your sort of portfolio that's been impacted, and we need some additional capital. And then the second side of that, which I think is even tougher for a lot of folks, although I have seen it work in the context of this situation, which was fantastic for a couple of companies. But it's is there a new investor segment that basically is interested in the opportunity to now participate in that business? The third one is the one that I sort of really, I saw a lot of positivity around the community and on LinkedIn and all these different webinars about, having you think about all these different things and sort of empathize with people. But, being a brutalist for one moment, the third option is that really you just don't have enough horsepower in the business and the structure and the mode you're in, with those factors I was describing to get through, and there's a scenario where you're looking to actually shut the business down. And I think this is the most challenging thing for founders because of that, responsibility good founders feel to the people involved in the venture, but also, they put their heart and soul into this. And so there's a, unashamedly ego element to this. And the danger with that is that, there's ways of shutting a business down. You can do it in a really structured way, just aware that, not every venture, in our world and in the Kiwi Landing Pad community, thrives and becomes a hit. And in fact, in the business world in general, particularly in that sort of medium business, it's about an 80% failure rate within 5 years. But it still doesn't make it any easier to actually get to those sorts of calls. And of course, we've had some fantastic support in our ecosystem in our country. The wage subsidy and a lot of things that have been great. They really, in my opinion, have been incredibly useful, but they've also delayed that reality for people making those decisions. So I don't think we're all out and about and moving around now, but we're by no means through that decision making and strategy process for most companies yet. We're still in there. So that's the survival side of things. On the sustainable side of things, I have a sort of different view on that, because one of my big frustrations is that New Zealand's obviously a fantastic place to live and be part of, but in terms of productivity, we're a seriously challenged nation around how productive we are. And this is not a early stage company or a tech industry or any sort of generalized. This is a generalization, and it's backed by data. One of the lowest performing OECD countries, a number of other sort of benchmarks. in the productivity mix. So the sustainability thing, I guess, is what we commonly sort of talk about, and the way I think about it is that sort of beach batch and BMW. So, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all, but it's, you know, to the question originally about, you know, why have these three modes? I think you need to know consciously for yourself and your investors and the business itself that that's the mode you're in. And so this is an issue that's been really interesting because, you know, a lot of these businesses in sustainable mode, you know, so that means that they've actually found market fit. They've actually been able to, you know, to start generating cash, generating positive cash flow, or certainly, you know, close to the line. And or in another scenario of sustainable that I've been dealing with some companies, you know, that they've been fortunate to have either taken quite a lot of investment capital recently, and so that's been coincidental. Or they've just had a philosophy or an ability to sort of, you know, be you know,
rainy day fund.
not a long way through an investment, or had a rainy day fund. So, you know, I think sustainable mode for people, it hasn't provoked the level of tension around the decision making, the discussions, but what it has done for a lot of these sustainable type ventures and companies is it's raised a lot of questions and quite a bit of tension between shareholders and executives and founders, because it's just provoked a conversation that's a really difficult one, especially for, you know, from a productivity point of view, which is, hey, look, you know, we're okay from a point of view of the current market change. But when I actually look at this, you know, let's got my investor hat on. When I actually look at this, you know, I invested in this 5 years ago, and you gave me a curve that was going upwards and to the right, you know, like 100 miles an hour, and we're kind of not there. And actually, you know, when I've been provoked to think about it around this, just to, you know, checking in as an investor and making sure everything's okay, and some founders have even started thinking about this themselves. And that was the other thing I really wanted to provoke for our community, is that you know, you've got these decisions to make around the metrics, the financial side of it. You know, can you actually get through? Do you have enough capital, cash reserves, all those things? But, you know, I think it's just a really good opportunity for, you know, highly optimistic people who really generally only have one thing in common, and that's that their most precious asset and their most finite asset is their time. And so that I've just been really intrigued as to why that hasn't been more explicit in some of these decisions, you know, at the founder level before you start going out and engaging with your investors or looking at the options for your company. Because, you know, we all go into these things with the best intentions. We go in excited, we go in sort of driven to just make this venture, you know, succeed, to solve this problem, and, you know, hit all the high notes. But the reality is, you know, that changes over time. And I think for a bunch of people I've talked to through, still talking to around this, it's I'm really encouraging that sort of personal view of what the return really has been on their time to this point. And, you know, is the venture actually at a stage where it's actually proving, or they're feeling still that it has that potential that they originally got everybody around and got excited, you know, 3-4 years ago? And just having a good conversation about that, because the productivity side of things in the sustainability mode, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a great business in terms of the return on your resources. And so, you know, you might be making more money than you're spending, but that could be at a level which basically, you know, around taxation, around market shifts and so forth, doesn't really point to any sort of rainy day fund like you were talking about. Doesn't necessarily point to somebody looking at the business from outside and saying the valuation of the business has increased significantly over those 5 years because of X and Y. So sustainability mode and that discussion and that sort of part two of the framework is really around, I think, a lot of people who, you know, to sum it up, have been brought to the table to have a conversation, which, you know, they've you know, I'm talking about, you know, investors, founders, you know, key people in the business, that isn't really being provoked by the fact that, you know, they've definitely had a slowdown in their market, but they've got all the reserves. But I think the smarter founders and the smarter people around those founders have said, well, let's just actually use this as an opportunity to take a good hard look at the base dynamics of the business. Even though we're in sustainable mode, it's all good. You know, we're definitely going to get through this. We've got all the right elements, but let's look at the overall, vision and objectives of the business and figure out, how we feel about that. So that's the sustainability mode. And then the third one is scaling mode, which has been fascinating and frightening to watch in some companies as well, because, there are a number of companies that have, that have really, Zoom, after doing 6 updates to be on this call is a great example. But you've also seen a very public and, large scale example of a company that just wasn't ready for that scaling quantum.
Hence all the security issues that came out initially.
So that's the thing, and there's security issues. There's this just the pure sort of infrastructure, and they always had a bold and ambitious plan. They're a very highly performing company before that, but this whole situation put them into serious, super scaling mode, and I think that's happened to to some companies, small number, but happened to some companies in our community, and for some of them, sadly, they've been unable to take advantage of that opportunity because they don't actually have, in terms of the ability to service immediately that demand or that scale. I've talked to a few companies with physical products where demand's gone off the hook, but supply chain has been one issue that they've never really thought about or looked at before because they've never put a lot of stress on it. And this is a physical company example in terms of a hardware product, but suddenly they've got all this opportunity, the orders running off the hook, but there's one critical component or one thing missing in that model, and it could just literally be only one thing, but without that thing, you can't basically service a customer demand, and that's an incredibly frustrating situation to be in. Now, the other side of that in the scaling mode, which I think is challenging quite a few in our community, is the temporary position of being in scaling. So contact tracing, I think, is a great example. So an immediate demand, good entrepreneurs, they're smart. They can hear the tune of where things are headed, the news feeds and stuff, and how we're going to get to be more interactive. It's like, well, we need to know where people are backwards and forwards, and so you sit there and you go, okay, well, that's a problem to solve, and there's like millions of people who have it, but of course they only have it. I mean, I don't know about you, but you go around Wellington to the cafes and so forth, one day after our announcement of level 1, and you don't see a single register, you don't see any trace of the contact tracing piece. It's just fascinating, and yet there was, like, from a scaling point of view, just a massive temporary demand for that, and I think that's really challenging for founders as well in terms of just figuring out whether you're in sustainable scaling mode in terms of, like, where's that market opportunity come from? Why is it presented to us? And can we service it? Where are the weak spots? And let's get a strategy that actually covers those or patches those until we get a bigger fix. And how long is it here for? Because you've got to be really careful about tooling up or investing a whole lot if it's created by the market shift and it's positive, but you need to be asking the questions about what that horizon is for the tenure of that market shift in terms of being able to actually get around it and take advantage of it as a company. How long is it here for?
Absolutely. And I guess one of the challenges that comes in with that as well is when you do have your metrics that you're pulling together, naturally, like as we were talking about before, as founders, we can be super optimistic. And realistically, when you look at your kind of like your optimal situation, say 3 scenarios that you're planning for, right? You look at your like optimal situation, what you think is probably mid-tier, and then your worst case scenario. How, from your view, are you seeing whether people are really looking at their worst case scenario as their worst case scenario, or do you think they're still kind of overshooting the mark and still sitting too much on the optimistic side? What are you saying?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's one that really we should be provoking in a number of ways. I mean, I've seen all types, to be honest. I've seen people, and I've talked to people where, frankly, and I have been candid with them, I'm like, is that, the best, I'm summarizing here, but is that the best you can do around a cost minimization, strategy to go through this? Because it doesn't really feel that effective. Or that inclusive, actually. You always find in these situations, they bring out in companies and individuals really the purpose and values of that organization. And, we've seen a lot of public examples where, and there are always surprises. There are companies that have responded, brilliantly to look after their people and so forth, and taken a really sort of inclusive and sort of multi-stakeholder approach. There are others that have just basically looked at, minimizing costs, retaining their own, situations, keep their salaries the same, but, expected or made people redundant or laid them off, and just had a very unbalanced approach to the whole situation. So, I think there's in terms of scenario planning around your question, I think, everybody, particularly investors, are expecting executives to have those scenarios, but I think they're also expecting them to be, realistic. One of the things I talk about in survival mode in particular is I've seen some people, really, in a positive way to just keep going, to figure things out, just cut everything, cut costs and so forth. But they've done that in the most well-meaning way, but they've actually effectively, strangled the business ability to do much at all. I think for others, it's identified for them for the first time, and this is a big kind of drum that I beat. If you've ever been to the landing pad jams and so forth, and the folks watching, is we don't talk to customers enough. And so when we map out these scenarios of cost reduction, all that sort of thing, it becomes really quickly in the conversations, a lot of the conversations I've had, becomes really quickly an internal thing. And this is the amazing thing. You're new to us, Casey, and you haven't been to a jam, but pretty much every jam we have 100 people in the audience. We ask the question, who's talked to a customer today? And it's a fascinating wave. Yeah. A fascinating wave of hands. It's an instant reaction to the question. So the people who have, and there's not many of them, put their hands up, and then the people, start figuring out that's probably the wrong answer, not to have their hand up, and then suddenly you see it. But it doesn't matter. We're not doing it to show people out, but it's just this fascinating. You build these things to solve a problem for a whole bunch of people who are called customers that you have out there, and yet. When we build these companies, we get fixated on building the plans and the scenarios and all those sorts of things. But let me just, kind of summarize it and say less plans than I would like, that I've been asked to critique or have a look at or contribute to, have a true customer view of what's really going on for the customers. So are they under planning or over planning? Yep, there's definitely a bunch of those things to your question, but I think the bigger issue is how much customer data has gone into that, and the customer data doesn't have to be, massively, factual stuff. It can be anecdotal. It doesn't have to be a lot of, actual sort of survey results and percentages. It can be just like conversations with people going, where do you see this going? How do you see this changing? How you use our products and services? And I think that's another wave, unfortunately, for our community, when we've moved to this, wonderful business model of software as a service, that we really need to be aware of in these planning scenarios, because a lot of folks, it's a stressed environment. They've focused their planning on the things that, cost them the most, or in some cases, if they're actually scaling through this, the opportunities that they need to focus on. And so for, a lot of these subscription type products and so forth, you're getting a vibe, or you're reporting back and you're thinking yourself that, it seems like demand hasn't really dropped off. We haven't seen a significant shift, but I think you really need to get in the weeds and challenge that with the customers to just understand. And I've seen a couple of examples now that we're sort of a bit further through this, a couple of months, where they always intended to have that subscription for that product or service, switched off. It's just that they haven't got around to doing it, or the payment cycle hasn't come, and you've got this horrible, unnatural, confidence or comfort that that actually, because they haven't done it immediately, they're likely to continue, and that's, I think, going to be the next wave of challenge that we're just going to see pan out around, billing cycles and just wider, sort of consideration of costs for companies.
Yeah, absolutely. There's essentially a lag there, and it kind of touches on what you were talking about before, of kind of like, while it's been amazing having all the different support, government funding and whatnot for businesses, in a way, it's also created this kind of false dichotomy where a lot of businesses and startups are essentially just kind of like hitting pause or watching the space without coming to those conclusions yet. So then all of a sudden, when like the subsidies start drying up or disappearing for whatever they're kind of leaning on, and then they all of a sudden start looking at, as you touched on before, like their cash run rate and their burn rate or whatnot, and maybe their revenues dipped, and then they start making hard decisions, and all of a sudden, okay, we turn this off, we turn that off, and it has a huge ripple effect.
Yeah, it does, and it's a really, as I say, my phrase is fascinating and frightening, because you're getting situations like that where it is waves of impact, but you're also seeing scenarios where, for all good reasons, the wage subsidy is a great example, but also I'm seeing for a lot of folks, banks actually coming in to customers that they do understand well, and going well beyond their thresholds of traditional banking practice, best practice. Raising leverage, results, deferring, trying to help. So it's all been well-meaning, but I think, the thing I just, this is part of the reason I wrote the series, is just really encourages, like, being an entrepreneur is about, rolling with the punches, taking the good and sort of patting yourself on the back for executing a good plan, well thought through, but you also get luck that comes into play, and you take those as well. And luck goes, both ways. You can be unlucky or lucky. So I think for a lot of companies, the support and the way that their key, the key people that allow them to exist, employees, their funding mechanisms, and so forth, they've provided some relief. They've accepted these cost reductions. But I think the key thing I'd really emphasise is that is just a temporary, and really wonderful extension of time to really go through these hard decisions and figure out which mode you're in and how you best do that, and take them. It's great, but make sure it's not delaying the hard conversations, and make sure you're not going to literally just, figuratively speaking, fall off a cliff once all these things start moving back into a more normalized or new normal situation. And we've got a lot of our community around that scenario as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the key piece there is that support is temporary, whereas it can't sustain you, right? Whether you're in survival mode, relying on that to survive, whether you're in a sustainable mode, or whether you're trying to scale, it's a temporary additional piece to the business. Some of the core themes I'm hearing, John, is for a start, it's getting kind of your metrics in order, and metrics will be different for different businesses, and being careful to stay away from vanity metrics and focus on kind of those core ones. And you kind of touched on cash, revenue, in your article you mentioned sales, demand generation, product market fit, and I'll link that shortly so everyone can have a full read over that if they haven't already.
Yeah,
but cool. Once you get that in order, the theme that I'm hearing is it's really strong communication. It's being able to talk to your different stakeholders, your other co-founders, whoever's involved in your startup, and making sure that you're kind of sense checking what your conclusions are, and that you are being realistic. But that all comes through sometimes difficult but honest and frank conversations with them. But then not just them, strong communication also with your customers, right? And that's what you're touching on, because like one of the amazing things that can come from that is you're going to deepen your relationship with your customer. So you're also going to create more, I guess, defensibility about losing them, because they're going to feel that they're supported. And I guess looking at like what the examples you just gave with the bank, although unfortunately there are some negative impacts that can happen with banks where there's this additional support, and it's not through the fault of the bank. It's through if a business or startup gets complacent with that support, because that support is never meant for the long run. So I guess just being clear on that piece there. But it's been amazing how engaged banks have been in talking to their customers and helping them through like the initial period. And I guess there's lessons to be learned from there in a positive way for startups and businesses to take that on board and say, actually, how can we look at what our traditional legacy services are? And if they're scaling, that's awesome, like really, really cool. But in many cases, that's not the case. So then it's like, okay, what are the peripheral services, talking to the customer, that we could offer that could add value for this time right now? So it's been adaptable, but again, that core thread that comes back to is being able to have those strong communication channels with everyone involved.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think not to focus for too long on just the banking side of things, and obviously we're aligned to the Bank of New Zealand very gratefully for their sponsorship of Kiwi Landing Pad. We can't do what we do without them, but I think that's a really interesting example of being careful about the perception at the top line, from some quarters versus what's really happening, and this is the key. So what I mean by that is when I've talked to companies, not all BNZ customers, but banks, to your point, I think the feeling I get is a number of them have stepped in to have good customer conversations to figure out really what's going on. And that doesn't mean they've been a soft target to just extend limits and do things, but they've had a good engagement. And yet at a top line, you see a lot of backwards and forwards, excuse me, around not a massive response. But you can't make that generalization. You have to dig into talking to, in this case, our community, to just see how that's been. And of course, the reason they get that top line perception, which I would say, if you looked at it in terms of the highlight, the headline media stuff, is it's like, well, it's been an average response, and there's obviously two sides to that. But I look at that and go, well, that's a classic example of like being really careful about taking that as a data point without actually going and talking to some companies and seeing actually what conversations and what's been brought to the table by the banks. Of course, the negative sentiment comes when we reach this challenge, which is the biggest and most contentious piece of that series around the survival mode, which is all the metrics point to this business not being a business that basically can survive. And often that's actually, again, just a roll up of a reality that's been rolling through the engagement with the market and creating the business well before this pandemic issue. And people don't like bad news. So and when they get bad news, they're always looking for a villain to sort of vindicate that it's not them. And I think that's the challenge about having those constructive conversations. That doesn't mean you always find a way to work together, in that sort of example we're using, the banking and the entrepreneur or the company's view, that's useful. There are limits to everything.
That makes a lot of sense. So for founders listening, when they're kind of going through this and they're kind of determining, and a lot of them will probably have a gut feel where they sit as well, if they truly kind of reflect on where they are. How does one approach these actions if they wanted to? Because I mean, one of the challenges that we've seen, particularly in Kiwi Landing Pad community and around everything happening in the space, is there's so much noise happening, right? And a lot of the founders are kind of struggling with that. So you can't implement everything and take action on everything.
Yeah.
And I guess a huge important piece of moving forward for anything is being able to take action. What would you recommend to the founders listening on kind of like, what are some tangible steps that they can take today that they should be thinking about if they haven't already, to kind of identify where they're at?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think to your point, the conversations we're having, it's one people are grappling with because there's just so many different variables. I think the first thing is embrace the concept that the only certainty at the moment is uncertainty for most people. So what that means to me is, take action, but get everybody around the fact that that action is going to be in much smaller steps, and there's going to be a level than normal operating environment, and there's going to be a level of consciousness about a much deeper assessment at the end of those smaller steps each time. And I really like having some key questions that everyone aligns around about setting this frame. The reason for trying to articulate the framework is I just found a lot of people were not able to have a consistent, aligned starting point to start taking these smaller steps. So part of getting that alignment is to know where you're at. What sort of mode you're in, whatever language you use around that. That framework's obviously just an example that I use personally that I've shared. But then also just know, in terms of that discussion and that framework, what questions you're going to have to answer to know that short step in these really sort of uncertain elements is going to determine that you continue and you're getting the right signals from that move, from that addressing the issue that you wanted. That's about having the right questions that everybody, as part of that review of that smaller step, gets the answers to, and that there's an open agreement that it's a collaborative process, and that you take action from that to adjust quickly, rather than just hoping and driving that next plan. And I think no, that's right, and I think that's the way you've seen. And now this is affecting very large organisations as well as our sort of early stage startup type community. Is you're seeing boards and you're seeing key executives, to your question, meeting more regularly, because you have to have that line of sight right through the organisation, whereas traditionally board meetings might be every month or a couple of months. But the information flow and the change in the information flow, the material change in it, is just so much faster. It's getting a little bit more extended now, but that would be the thing I would say, is like get that embraced, so that executives, founders are not having to race around providing a whole lot of sort of validation information, because there's only limited. Again, your finite asset is your time in these things. So don't create a sort of reporting culture alongside that shorter term meeting that is really cumbersome, and just encourage everybody to go into a more real time environment to provide that info, not necessarily as well formed or as well presented, but it comes back to those questions that everyone agrees, to your question, to get ready to be able to answer, or just have a perspective on when you say, hey, we're meeting next week because we said we'll do this for the next 5 days. And these are the questions we need to answer about maybe some metric stuff, or even just some anecdotal elements to determine whether we keep going with that, or whether we have to sit down and change that. So those periods of time for a lot of organisations are getting longer now. It's getting a little bit more structured, back to sort of just having more time for execution. But it really depends on the type of organisation and where you're at.
Absolutely, and I guess that's a key piece, right? Is that while frameworks are incredibly important in regards to being able to kind of get some direction, at the end of the day, every startup has so many nuances that are unique to that startup and their situation, that they also have to look at it through a lens of what makes sense for them. And there's never going to be a cookie cutter approach. But so I guess just kind of distinguishing that this is about kind of getting general navigation and being able to provoke those questions to get people on the same page, and not necessarily these questions in itself. So I've just linked that in the chat, folks. If you've read of that, it's a great read. It's the framework John's talking about that he pulled together of these common threads he's seeing. But it's a guide to get in the right direction of asking the questions.
Yeah, I mean, what that is how I run my my time trying to give people a perspective, and this is the key thing. It is just one perspective, and I think the smartest founders, and it was drilled into me by a number of my mentors over my time doing this sort of stuff, that at the end of the day, if you're the founder, you have to make the decision. And a good decision is generally one where you have good perspective as well as advice. And we've riffed on this before in the landing pad community about the difference between perspective and advice. So perspective anybody has, and it's really useful in the right context. But what you find challenges a lot of people is when you start taking advice from people who are not qualified to be advisors. So, the founder decision-making process is quite challenging, especially in times like these, because a lot of people will come to the table to help. A lot of people will be very opinionated about what needs to be done. But what you have to do, in my opinion, as a founder, is you have to come out of that. You have to have some sort of framework to kind of, figure out the right way to communicate. Because the framework I've shared is just the way that I try and be useful as fast as possible by asking the questions that give me a sense of which mode the company is in. And then you can start to give some more useful perspective, because there's not much point in having a conversation about, entering a new foreign market. You're in the US and now you want to go to Canada, or vice versa, if the company's in survival mode and they don't have market fit, really. And there's no judgment around it, it's just the reality of where it's at. But if they don't have market fit in New Zealand, what is the baseline, or what are the base factors that someone would have to say that they are able to then just look at a new market and get that thing that they're lacking, that crucial thing they're lacking in some other market that's further away, that's going to take them away from, one of the key issues that they would have, which is still don't have a consistent response from the market, for our product, and we don't have that fit in the market. So I think that's the thing, is that you obviously just can't sit out there and wait to sort of get all these perspectives and so forth in. But as a founder, I think it's about having that framework and having that thought process to obviously listen to the content of what people are telling you and responding to. It's usually always well-meaning, but also to be able to figure out where to put that, which bucket to put that in terms of adding some asset to your decision-making process. Is it perspective from somebody who, the best example I always give is like, and we see it, I've seen it quite a lot in our community, is you go to meet your lawyer and they give you the information about forming the company or an ESOP scheme or whatever it might be. And then you start, you have a conversation in that meeting with an advisor who's a legal advisor, and you've touched on tax. And so, suddenly when the question's asked, did you get legal advice? Yes. Do you know the tax position? Yes. And it's like, well, no, you haven't actually covered that full decision, because what you got is a perspective on the tax side of that from a legal advisor. Now, sometimes they, well-rounded people are good, but you just can't assume that, cutting the corners, because that's where these platforms for poor decisions, if you start rolling them back, actually start to become apparent, because you've just mixed those things together, and there are missing pieces which you think you had valid, qualified answers to, which weren't actually the case.
And there's like a hidden challenge in there as well that you just touched on, which is like you're talking about taking advice from people that can come from a place of credibility as a great foundation. And the challenge that can happen is when people, you touched on this right now, someone gives advice and they are a credible person, but they may not be credible on the topic of which they're giving advice.
No, I like it.
And it's so easy to mix those two.
Yeah, well, not only are they a credible person, Casey, but they are actually tangible in the system. So investors are a great example. They've invested in your business. They put cold hard cash into it. They might even sit on your board, and they certainly want a voice around advice, and they do it in a really well-meaning way. But you've got to be really careful about, and you feel like it comes from the credibility side of things, because they've got that sort of CV, if you like, and association. But it is a critical piece, and this is about having these conversations, and this is the difficult bit, because they're often people you look up to, or certainly don't, maybe are challenged a little bit by being challenged. That when you get to the decision-making process, it's not the loudest voice around the table, or the most, sort of vested voice. And this happens on the other side of things too. I get discussions with investors who are frustrated that the founder, in their opinion, is not really taking on enough of this, and just sort of, founders are often the largest shareholder. It's an incredibly nuanced style of governance that you have for a lot of early stage companies, because if you're an independent board director, you're going into a board generally where the CEO or founder is quite often also the largest shareholder, and then you have this kind of fiduciary duty to do the best thing for the company, which isn't actually just one or other shareholder, it's the company overall. And then suddenly you see the problems with this, where's this advice coming from, the credibility of it, and is it actually perspective, or does it actually, is it advice? So it's like you say, every situation is different, but it's a tricky thing to navigate. And obviously we're doing all this stuff at speed to try and optimize the new changes in market shift for these companies.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that kind of touches on the core threads. It's been a great conversation, John. And having read through the articles multiple times, I highly recommend everyone listening to read them as well. After this, I will email them to everyone that's joined the call as well, so you can kind of go straight to them. But John, would you have any closing thoughts for the community?
Look, no, I mean, I sort of virtually swap and sit beside you on this from a landing pad point of view. Is that, the big challenge for us, being a community of entrepreneurs, for entrepreneurs in this time, is really understanding from you all what it is that you are challenged by and what we can add value to in terms of finding speakers, or content, or just driving that, a useful contribution to these decisions that you have to make, to these challenges that you want to connect with more people on, whatever it is. So we really just encourage that active, simple as just sending an email, a couple of lines on something like that. And one of the feedback elements that we have had, which we've taken on board, because it makes perfect sense, is I think now that we're sort of through a lot of the initial, probably no other word for it, the shock phase of this massive market change, people are wanting to get back on what Landing Pad has always been, I think, very positively recognised for, which is the insights into these markets, which is, for a lot of us, where our markets are, significantly, or in the majority case, offshore. Of course, a lot of these countries, they've been massively impacted. We're a very different story as a direct response in the metrics around COVID-19. But from a pure business point of view, a lot of these geographies, the US and so forth, they've largely been carrying on doing business. And so we want to respond to the fact that, we took not an insular view, but certainly a more local view to the initial response piece around mental health and so forth. And so now, and you'll probably give folks in communications over the next few days a bit of an insight into our June webinar role, and there's a lot more people actually in these markets coming through to give us their perspective. So yeah, that's all I would say, is just we only do this if it's useful and adds value and helps you as a founder, entrepreneur, or part of that sort of entrepreneurial team and journey. So please just help us make sure that what we're focused on trying to bring to the table in these webinars and content is the stuff that you really get value or need to hear and see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there's an interesting point there as well, with quite often for startups, New Zealand is a testing ground as a market, and it may be that they stay based here, but to really scale, they need to start considering other markets depending on where they're trying to go. And that's where that kind of perspective of international markets, and the States in particular, but now kind of more going towards Europe or Canada, UK, whatnot, they're real opportunities. And as you say, they are definitely still trading. And it's a case though of getting advice from the right people to kind of help build up your understanding of what that looks like for you. We had a great webinar last week with Marvin from former partner of 500 startups. He's invested and worked with over 400 startups, and is just incredibly candid and amazing in regards to the work he's done and kind of the insights he has. So we, to your point, John, we're bringing more of that to the forefront. So for those listening, coming up, we've got looking more into the VC landscape with Founders Fund. We've got product-led growth. We've got NZTE are coming on for a webinar, which is going to be great because, man, they're going through some rapid challenges that they've been stepping up to the mark to help with, and then marketing from a startup lens as well, particularly in Silicon Valley, and how that kind of expands out to the rest of the world. So lots of exciting webinars to come, and I'll be sharing those details shortly, so stay tuned for everyone. But thank you so much, John, for sharing those insights. It's been a great conversation. Thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you on the next webinar.
Well, thanks, everyone. Catch you later.